Today, we're going to dive into some last minute strategies for end of year giving. And so how do we think about last minute strategies? We need things that are going to have a really big impact that are going to be little to zero work, right? So that's really how we thought about this. We said, okay, what are the smallest things you can possibly do that are going to have an outsized impact? And so we'll talk a little bit about all the things that are making this end of year a little bit different. We'll talk about what that likely means for fundraising. And then what are some small tweaks that could have a 10, 20, 30, 40%, or 100% even increase in your end of year results, which is pretty cool. So hold tight for that. Couple quick notes before we get started. First things first, this is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. So this is professional development. Many of you have this. If you don't worry about it. And there is a survey at the end that will drop into the chat. And you just need to fill this out very quickly to make sure we get that. So please do that at the end of the session. Here's the agenda, pretty basic. And a big note here is that the recording and the slides will be sent around later today. So all this is going to happen. All right, so very quick intros because I know many of you either in person or virtually. My name is Patrick. Very lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of FreeWill alongside Jenny, who's just the best. And our team is really wonderful, about 205 folks. And we've just actually, since the last session, crossed $7 billion in money committed and given to charity. We focus on all sorts of transformational gifts, a lot on planned gifts, stock, crypto, some retirement account giving, et cetera. So that's pretty cool. And then I think last thing before we get started, we're so grateful that you're here. And so one of the things we like to do is give away some gifts to the people that joined. We are going to be sending a copy of this book by Brené Brown called Daring Greatly. Many of you will have read other Brené Brown books to 20 people. Again, at the end of the session, just make a small note in the survey, if you don't mind, and we'll select some folks and send it out. And if you don't get a book, it's widely available at your beloved local independent bookstores as well as online. And so feel free to do that. Fun fact about Brené Brown: lives in Texas, lives in Austin, helps own a small pickleball team, which is cool, but generally is a great writer and a great thinker. So go for it. Okay, so we'll talk about how your week is going. Let's get this up here. All right, so we've got some bad news here. We ask folks sort of week over week. You can see this over the course of this calendar year, and actually the sort of happiness blue line is the lowest it's been, and anxiety is the highest it's been, or close to it, with a little bit of June, which I believe followed the Uvalde disaster. So if anyone in the chat wants to comment on why we think these lines are converging, whether it's just some frenetic midterm elections in key states, whether it's something else, would love to hear. So feel free to make a note in the chat, and would love to see some opinions there. And then more interesting news, as the stock market's taken a bit of a tumble over the past 2 weeks, you actually see much lower confidence in people hitting their goals this year. And so it's really important to understand. So if this is you, don't feel like you're alone here. And if this is you, also think about, let's dive in here and say, okay, what are a couple of the small things that we can really shoot your confidence back up? One important note here is that scales matter on graphs. And so this is a 3.5 to 4. So if we had zoomed out in 1 to 5, it would seem a lot smaller. But we want to do this to make sure that we're seeing this. Clark says midterms, economic issues, inflation, some lingering effects of COVID, less optimism as the year ends, things like that. A lot of global difficulties, et cetera. Great, okay. All right, so let's dive in. We asked about your end of year plans and what you choose to promote the most. You obviously see really big focus on small donor cash and major cash gifts. Actually, a really pretty sizable focus on qualified charitable distributions. And these are gifts out of your IRA. They're one of the fastest growing types of giving. If you are not focused on this, we would recommend doing some exploration there. QCDs are even higher than donor advised funds, for example. Stock gifts, obviously, sort of the highest thing after cash giving. Many of you will know that stock gifts are one of the most important ways to drive growth at your organization. Pretty high plan gifts, a little bit lower on crypto, and a couple of other, a lot in the other category. So that's what the rest of y'all are up to. And then we ask how you define success, meeting or exceeding fundraising goals, re-engaging lapsed donors, acquiring new donors. These are a lot of the big things that people are thinking about right now. So assume many of you are in this category. So why is end of year so important? I mean, we'll talk about, we talk about end of year. It's worth briefly aligning on why this matters. About 20% of all charitable giving happens in December. So it ends up being, by far the biggest month. October, November, December are often the biggest months collectively. This, by the way, is true across sectors and year over year with a couple of small variations. So I actually want to show you this. We'll hold it on the screen for a minute. In 2021, this is what giving looked like across sector. And so thanks to Blackbaud for this. You can see if in the far right-hand side, December is by far the biggest, right? Only in say, international affairs, medical research, and faith communities is it under 20%. Human services about 19.6, but across the board, it is almost always the biggest month, right? And the highest sort of peak there is around healthcare, environment, K through 12 education, public and society benefit, animal welfare. All of these are really benefiting from a big December push. Now you can see a couple of other things here that might be interesting. June tends to be the second highest month for higher ed. You get a lot of reunions then, a lot of sort of end of year giving. International affairs, this can be all over the place, right? So, you might think that June number is going to be true year over year for higher ed. International affairs may be response giving. And so, June may have seen a lot of giving around a specific event. Someone else can sort of opine on what was happening in the world in 2021, in June in particular, but you can see that across the board. So some pretty interesting stuff. February tends to be the lightest month of giving. Anyone have any guesses as to why that is? Don't see any guesses in the chat yet. Tax season, it's because people are broke, taxes, Valentine's Day. And then a lot of people say, what I believe is the right answer is that it's the shortest month. So there are just fewer days of giving in February, but you can see a pretty steep drop off in January, say after December, right? A lot of giving happens in December, and then, January is the second lowest month here across the board. One other note before we actually pull off of this is that, oftentimes people will think of the summer as slow months, and a little bit, but, August is higher than July. It's also about the same as April. It's higher than January. It's higher than February. So just to sort of put that in context as you think about your yearly plan, it's an interesting reflection. A lot of people sort of have this sense as to when giving happens, but don't actually look at the numbers, and this can be quite valuable. So why does this happen, right? So we know that it happens, and it's just sort of assumed across the nonprofit sector that end of year is always the best, but we never talk about why. Deadline driven really matters. So things like Giving Tuesday, Stock Monday, which tends to be the day right before Giving Tuesday. Obviously the end of the year, December 30 and 31st, and messaging like your last chance to give by midnight tonight. There are obviously tax deadlines to receive deductions. But why do deadlines even matter, right? We sort of take it as a given that deadlines work. And the science around this is that the sense of urgency improves motivation. And there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law. States that there's more mental arousal or stress, a more efficient person becomes up into a certain point. So the appropriate amount of stress, example, end of year deadlines, can inspire increased productivity or performance. End of year gives people a challenge to donate, to complete by a deadline with a great emotional payoff, right? This sort of like deadline driven moment. I think one of the things that people sort of imagine when they're kids or even later on is, thinking about making that shot at the buzzer, right? As everything compresses, as time counts down, or we're stepping onto that stage at the big moment for a performance. All that stress creates the excitement. And that's actually a little bit of what you see at end of year giving. End of year giving is driven also by social proof. So people want to behave in the way that their peers do. And there's so much noise around end of year that it actually just makes people assume that everybody else is doing it, right? We saw some research that shows bequest giving go up considerably. It actually triples to 15% compared to 5% when donors believe they're one of many supporters doing the same. And so this prompting from all these other organizations actually increases giving to your organization as well. All right, so that's general end of year. And you all know that, but it's important to sort of understand, why is it happening? What pieces fit together that have made end of year giving so important over the last couple of decades? So a couple things make this unique. One is there's a high profile midterm election. So this was not true last year. It's Tuesday, November 8th. Many of you know that. Every single seat in the House, 34 of 100 Senate seats, 36 gubernatorial races will be contested. There are also a relatively high amount of contested seats among those this year. This means there is a ton of attention for donors across the country, and there is a ton of attention for voters, particularly in specific areas, right? Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania. New York was looking like not that close, and suddenly the gubernatorial election in New York, where you're going to have a huge population and a huge donor base. Florida, right? Big election there. California has some meaningful elections happening. And so a lot of this is just drawing the attention, and it just feels like a barrage to a lot of folks, right? Some of you who are in these states can attest to what it feels like right now. And boy, that's only going to go up over the next 2 weeks or so. Current estimates, by the way, what's going to happen in the elections? Well, there's a range of outcomes, a really remarkable variety of possibilities right now. There's a 36% chance, roughly, that Democrats control the Senate and Republicans control the House. There's a 20% chance, roughly, that Democrats retain both houses of Congress, and a 44% chance of full Republican control, right? And from a policy standpoint, these might look vastly different. In a future session after the election, we'll actually look at, what were the results and what is that likely to mean for legislation, and what is that legislation likely to mean for fundraising? But we won't talk about that now. What we will talk about is how change in power affects donor motivation. And here's what we've seen in past elections and from some really good research by Conklin and Foshi. Post-election research shows a 58% increase in contributions to folks aligned with the losing party, and a small decrease in folks aligned with the winning party. Now, most of you are not going to be formally aligned with Democrats or Republicans, but you might have a much more progressive bent, a much more conservative bent. Those are all obviously possible. Some of you will be neither, right? You're an art museum. Great. You sort of, hang out as far from politics as you can. You'll see a slight decrease in non-aligned or apolitical organizations, but it's pretty minimal, right? So I wouldn't worry about that compared to economic factors or other things like that. Why does this happen? Well, when two parts, right? First is a lot of giving is response giving, and what you might think of as sort of contrary giving, pushing back against something, which is much more motivating than making something happen in the first place. This is how humans tend to be. The second is that when the opposite party is in power, people see some of these civic organizations as the thing standing up to them. Where when your party is in power, people see the party as the thing pushing it forward. So there's fewer donations in that direction. It's interesting to see. And so what this means is that if you are a conservative organization, there is a 20% chance that your giving might go way up if Dems control everything, right? A 44% chance that you might see a decrease if people feel like, well, Republicans have taken both houses, I can take my foot off the gas, right? The opposite is obviously true if you lean more liberal or progressive. So just a thing to keep an eye on. A couple other things. We see big time inflation and economic fluctuations. During years of economic growth, average giving increases by about 5%. During economic downturns, we see a slight decrease. During 08-09, which is way worse economic situation than what we currently saw, we saw about a 10% cut. But impacts on the stock market specifically often correlate with giving. So you'll see some elements there. So interesting to see. The important thing to know here is that not all sectors go down during this. So people prioritize what's important to them. And there's a lot of lessons we can learn about how to position ourselves during a potential recession in a way that actually increases giving. Other things to note, impulse to give isn't lessened by inflation, but the amount or type of gift may be affected. And the value of a dollar that you receive is actually less than it used to be because you can't purchase as much services, as many goods, et cetera, in that. And so we really have to think about strategically how to make the most of giving during an inflationary period. We'll talk about some of that. Other big things happening, we are seeing the continuing march of demographics, right? The only thing we know to be true is that everybody ages by a year every year. And so we can predict demographic changes well in advance. 72 million millennials are in the United States. They have recently surpassed baby boomers as the largest American generation. Nearly 3/4 of millennials identify as a philanthropist. And over the next 25 years, as much as $70 trillion will be passed on to this group by baby boomers. What does this mean? This means these are already making up about 20% of all giving. Millennials are already making up 20% of all giving and really stepping into their own. So over the next few years, including this end of year, you're going to see a big increase in millennial giving compared to everybody else. Here's one of this fascinating stats from Fidelity Charitable. The number of folks who agree with the statement, I consider myself a philanthropist. And I would imagine that many of you are in this category. Total about 45%, but only 35% of baby boomers, 48% of Gen X, which is a pretty impressive jump, and 74% of millennials. I mean, this is really remarkable. Now, there's not a ton of data as to why this is. So a couple hypotheses that may or may not be true. The internet has made giving more accessible. It's also made news and community work and advocacy more accessible. And so a lot more people are communitarian minded. Millennials are also less likely to have children at the same age as baby boomers or Gen X. And so that creates a little bit more space for focus outside one's own family. Although there's obviously some correlation with having children with some other types of giving as well. So interesting stuff there. Number 3, shifting demographics. I mentioned this in the inheritance world. By 2030, millennials will have 5 times as much wealth as they have today. Boomers had fewer children than their parents did, so inheritances end up being more concentrated. So a couple of things are different here, right? So 15 years ago, you would have had silent generation beginning to pass away, passing money on to Gen X. What happened there? Well, the silent generation had much less money and more kids. So you had a smaller numerator and a larger denominator. And now boomers have fewer children and more money to pass on. And so the inheritance per child is going up dramatically, even more so than the wealth differentiation between the two generations. Of millennials, there's about 700,000 millennial millionaires in the United States right now. Of those millennial millionaires, 700,000 millennial millionaires, of those, more than half became millionaires by inheritance. And so this is going to be one of the primary wealth building aspects of this organization. And decisions are obviously being made now on how that wealth is being distributed. So, this great wealth transfer is incredibly important for planned giving. If you don't have a big planned giving plan in place, get one right now. But also it means we really have to be thoughtful around how we're going to make the most of millennial wealth. So, okay, that's what's happening in the world. There's obviously a lot of other stuff, but that's some of the really big macro trends we're seeing. Let's talk about how do you actually make the most of it. The really big thing is inflation is squeezing people, right? What is happening? What we're seeing here is when you ask me for money, my expenses have gone up over the past year, right? Housing goes up, gas goes up, groceries go up. Most people's paycheck does not go up month over month, even though prices go up month over month. So I'm feeling squeezed on my income. So I'm actually less likely to give you out of that, which is why the anchor point is really important. If we say, hey, give out of your income, you will get much smaller gifts or no gifts compared to anchoring on a different thing. So what are we anchoring them on? We're anchoring folks on their investments, their assets, et cetera, as opposed to their income. This is incredibly important. So I want to share the results of a really, really interesting experiment that I sort of uncovered thanks to my friend, Dr. Russell James, and we were doing some correspondence a few weeks ago. And one of the things that he likes to highlight is this really fascinating experiment that happens in the state of Massachusetts. And you get a bunch of grad students outside and they're giving, they basically say, hey, we'll give you a gift card if you want to participate in this study. And we divide the folks coming to this grocery store into 2 groups. Group 1 says, hey, what's in your wallet? Cash, credit cards? What else? The other group said, hey, do you own stocks? Do you own bonds? Tell me about your investments. And that's all. They had this conversation going in. They said, great, here's your gift card, which wasn't for the grocery store. It doesn't throw off the results there. Said, thank you so much. We'll see you when you come out. And then on the way out, they just say, hey, can we look at your receipts? Can we just see what you bought? And the result is the folks who are reminded about their investments spent 36% more at the same grocery store at the same time compared to an identical group who was reminded about their wallets, right? So this is a really important point for fundraising, right? The comparisons that people are making, because people make relative choices as opposed to objective choices, vastly shape behavior, right? These people are equally hungry. They were equally stressed for time. They're sort of equal on all parts because there's a totally random assortment of shoppers. And suddenly you see dramatically different behavior. I mean, 36% is a huge bump in a grocery bill from people that were roughly sort of, similar. And so what we see here is that people who feel wealthy act charitably. There's another interesting study where college students were asked to report their savings. And then they were asked to make a donation after this. And some of these folks were given a scale of 0 to 500 for their savings, where all of them, most, or if not all of them, were sort of way above the scale. And then 0 to 50,000. And by actually concatenating how much money they were asked to do, and they all felt like they were at the top of the scale, they increased subsequent donations because they felt wealthier. And so there's some other things we can do here. The thought process is if you're not in the lower bracket, you're wealthy, and you can sort of, we'll play with this and we'll talk about it a little bit more. So how do we remind donors of their wealth? There's a really important strategy here, which is going to take you almost no time and can dramatically increase giving. So we'll show two strategies. The first one is more focused on the research we just showed. When you are sending your normal end of year giving, just whatever you already have planned, add something like this parenthetically after you ask for money. Did you know you can also give out of your investments, stock, crypto, or retirement accounts? And by the way, what you really should be doing is linking to the ways to do that in this email. But even if you don't, we really want to include this. You can let them know they can donate stock and have a bigger impact, right? These gifts are larger than cash gifts. And there's two different strategies that happen at the same time here. The first is that we're generating more of these investment gifts, right? These asset gifts tend to be way larger. Crypto gifts are averaging, I think, $7,000 a pop right now. Stock gifts are like $10,000. Qualified charitable distributions every IRA are like $5,000 or $6,000. Cash gift is about $100. So we're talking 50, 60 to 1 in terms of ratio. But it will also increase the size of cash donations, which is a really important point that a lot of people miss, right? They think, oh, there's too many options. What it really does is anchor donors on how wealthy they are instead of thinking about just the income they have. So this is your first really big step in order to jump up that giving with relatively little work, right? We know all the benefits of non-cash giving, but we also now know that reminding people of their assets increases the grocery shopping by 38% and is likely to have some positive impact for giving. So that's really interesting. Second, ask for more at the high end. So there's this other interesting piece, which is a little bit of a different theory than what we just saw. There's an experiment using 60,000 fundraising letters from a hospital. And the standard letter followed the charity's normal practice. So this is direct mail. And the response card used three most common amounts, right? $100, $50, $10, $50, $100. And then there was an alternate version that said 10, 50, 100, 250, 500, right? Same donors, again, randomly selected. And which one do you think performed better? 10, 50, 100, or the 10, 50, 100, 250, 500? Higher amounts, yeah. So a bunch of folks say the higher amounts. And that's right. But here's a sense of how massive this was. Same letter, same stuff, all that same text, right? So presumably, you guys all work on fundraising teams. You can imagine how long it took to get approval for that letter. Every word, executive director is signing off on it. 3 people are proofreading it. Adding these 2 extra buckets doubled the overall take from the same letter. Very little work and a ton of upside. So this is sort of a second strategy here, right? So the first one is make sure we're mentioning investments. Second is make sure we're pushing up that high end. Now, what's interesting here is that a different sort of relatively strange version worked just as well. $10 or $500 or whatever. And this had a similar effect of doubling. So what we see is really having some of that top end, pushing up that high end is valuable. Now, you might ask, should we push up all the amounts? And what we saw in this experiment is that it's not the same. And that if you increase a smaller amount too much, it makes smaller amounts seem inaccessible and can reduce the number of people the total number of people that give. So what we really want to do here is make sure we have an accessible amount, but make sure we have a really high amount as well. I believe this experiment is a couple years old. So if you think about inflation, you can push up that top number beyond 500. And suddenly you might see a dramatically different take from your direct mail, from your email, from your credit card forms than you might otherwise, right? And again, this is something you do once, or you make this small shift. And in this experiment, it doubled overall giving. So those of you that are concerned about hitting end of year giving, let's start layering some of these pieces on, and you'll see, hopefully a lot better results. Strategy 3. So many of you have been really focused on donor advised funds. These allow donors to put money into an investment fund with a sponsoring org and then recommend grants later. Most of you know this. Money is usually invested in this account, mostly in mutual funds or index funds, so the funds grow over time. And what we saw is that at the end of 2020, there was about $35 billion put into these. There's something like more than $100 billion total sitting in donor advised funds right now. Huge, the grants were 35 billion. I mean, just unbelievable growth of these things. It's enormous. So what do we want to do? There are two big steps here. The first thing is we need to understand why they got so big. Why did DAFs get so big? Well, 2/3 of contributions going into donor advised funds are non-cash assets, and they are primarily publicly traded stock. So if you have your DAF donors, you want to ask them about stock giving, because they might not know they can give to you instead of just sending it over to Vanguard or Fidelity. One of the things we strongly recommend is on November 28th, which is right before Giving Tuesday, we really encourage folks to push appreciated assets, not just on that day, but as they begin to think of all their end of year giving they're going to do anyway. This is one of the biggest ways to take that $100 donor and turn them into a $10,000 donor. Many of you know this, but we will reiterate it because it is the single most important piece of academic research about modern fundraising. Organizations that accept appreciated assets grow 5 times faster on average than those who accept only cash. So if you are not pushing stock giving, you should be doing so. Going to your DAF donors is a really good way to do so. So we'll name that as well. Strategy 4, right? So we talked about that $70 trillion that's going to get passed on over the next 20 years, but those decisions about where that money goes is happening right now. What does that mean? It means one of the best times to ask for a planned gift is when a donor has already given. This is the moment of deep engagement. They have decided that your lucky organization, is one of the few places that they're going to give to this year. And it can be especially effective to upsell a donor, to become a legacy donor in your thank you note. Now, this is true all year round, but especially true because a lot of those small donors are coming to you at end of year giving, right? All of you said at the beginning of the session that your number one outreach was small dollar cash stuff. This is a really, really smart way to do it. Here's an example. This would be automated, or you could have a staff member send it out shortly after. And thank you so much for your gift. As you know, it was Giving Tuesday. We raised over $50,000 to feed our rescue puppies for the next year. We couldn't have done it without your generosity. I also want to share one more way that many other people are choosing to have an impact this year. So we're using that social proof that we talked about as so powerful at the beginning. Make a gift in your will. It costs you nothing during your lifetime. It's a powerful commitment, et cetera. You can learn more here, right? So this is either manually done the next day after Giving Tuesday, after end of year, or put into your automated work. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But people are in the spirit of giving. Giving Tuesday is one of the very few times all year they're thinking about how to give, right? End of year is the time where they're really thinking about how do I allocate, how do I make these decisions? And remember, these planned gifts, many of them can be $1 million. We started the call with a bunch of people sharing really happy stuff. And Lori, I believe in Pennsylvania, although Lori, apologies if I'm wrong there, just received $1 million planned gift this year. I don't know if she can share or if she knows, but my guess is, the highest gift that person might have made might be $1,000, $2,000. It also might be $50 or $100. There's a lot of these big gifts. And so you really don't want to miss out on these, especially as we enter the Great Wealth Transfer. All right, strategy 5. This is small, but we've seen some really interesting results here recently. A lot of folks on this call recently participated in something called Make a Will Month, which is August. It's a big push to do estate planning and encourage plan giving. Outreach to internal staff was the second most powerful method of generating gifts beyond broad email to donors. And so really considering at least sending a quick note to your staff and welcoming them to give, to support, as well as giving them full permission to not give if they like, maybe a really interesting asset. So think about that. So your staff obviously already believes in the mission. That's why they're there. Providing things like a free will making tool benefits them, but you can also ask for cash donations and other things like that. And it can be just this little extra boost to help you meet your fundraising goals. And then the last thing we'll say is that repetition just tends to be key and welcome, right? There's a lot going on, and I forgot is the #1 reason donors don't give. So make sure you're giving donors multiple touches, multiple emails. I wouldn't really be shy in December on how much you're emailing. Social media is helpful. It's still, much less important than email. Things like website pop-ups or takeovers, all this stuff matters, but honestly, more email tends to be very useful. So we'll pause there. And just to recap, right? So what are the big things? We are going to change the way we talk about some of the gifts, especially in an inflationary environment. We're going to anchor people on their assets, which are abundant, as opposed to their income, which is getting tighter. We're going to push up that high end on pricing, right? We're going to think about how to use our thank you notes and leverage those more effectively. We're going to talk to our staff. And there are a bunch of these small things that added together can have really, really outsized impact. And so hopefully that's all very useful. My marketing team would like me to share a little bit of what our partners say about FreeWill, because we're really proud of our team. Our friends over at the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship Foundation, they were already experts in plan giving, and they really wanted to make it easier for older and younger donors to give. They wanted to make it easier for the foundation to accept some of these big gifts. And so they partnered with FreeWill to provide for online bequest tools, retirement account giving in the forms of qualified charitable distributions, and stock tools. And what they learned in 2 years is they got nearly $1 million in planned gifts, and the tools more than paid for themselves with all the real-time giving. So it was a huge win for them across the board. And what they say is, I do not think I've ever worked with a partner that offers the level of strategy and turnkey solutions that FreeWill offers. It's incredible. So that's cool. That's what our team does. We're really, really proud of it. And if you want to learn more, go for it. And if not, here's what Sean writes too. I won't read this whole thing, but basically says it's like having extra staff at our fingertips, and they love it. So if you're ever interested, feel free to hit us up and we'll walk you through the tools and share how it works and what it costs and all those things. All right, so a couple last logistic notes. One, we are going to give this book away. My colleague June is going to drop in the survey to the chat, if that's okay. Thank you, June. It's right there in the chat. So fill that out now if you get a moment. A couple other resources for you. We put together a Giving Tuesday toolkit. A lot of these templates, a lot of the sort of like best practices in writing, some email templates for your stock donors, and then this whole playbook around fundraising during a recession that people have really loved. So just make a small note in the survey and we'll send them to you. You can obviously share them with your team. As I mentioned earlier, if you ever want to think about working with us, feel free to chat. We work with 1,000 organizations of all shapes and sizes. We tend to be a really strong fit for organizations with more than $1 million in annual revenue, or about 5,000 in email supporters. That's sort of so we can make sure we're being valuable to you. But we tend to really love our partners and learn a lot from them. And hopefully they learn something from us as well. All right, so let's go through. Oh, one other thing that's really cool that I want to spend 1 minute on before we get to questions, because we have more time today than usual. In 2 days, in almost exactly 48 hours, my dear friend and colleague Chris is going to hold a short session. So I think it's about 30 minutes. And what she's going to do is walk through how for organizations that are interested to be featured on freewill.com. So freewill.com is now the #1 estate planning tool in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people use it to allocate literally something like $60 billion a year, $100 billion a year in total assets, and a whole bunch of that goes to charity. And so Chris is going to walk through, what does it look like to be featured in your county if you are a local animal shelter, or your state, if you are, you know, a major state school, or the entire United States, if you have a really important health cause across the board. And some of these partners at a national level are doing, you know, $30 million in new plan commitments every year. So it's you know, by far the most effective plan giving tool that's ever been created, and we're super proud of it. So feel free to check that out with Chris. I think there's just a small note in the survey, and we'll send you an invite if you're interested. Oh, and then last thing before I get to questions, tonight I'm starting the long journey from New York to Reno, Nevada for the Charitable Gift Planners National Conference. I know that some of you have never heard of this, and a lot of you are going to go. So I'll be there with some other Freewheel folks. We would love to meet you and say hi. So we'll have a little table and hang out there. And we're also having a cocktail party for our, you know, our friends on Tuesday night. So if you want to come, if you're going to be in Reno and you'd like to come, shoot me an email if you haven't already gotten an invite. But we'd love to say hi and meet in person. And I'm just patrick@freewheel.com in case you are interested. So come hang out. Hopefully, you know, in the chat, actually, if you're going to be in Reno, just let us know. We'd love to come see you. And with that, there's a whole bunch of really good questions. I'm going to dive into those. If you don't mind taking 30 seconds right now to take that survey, that will be hugely helpful to us. And we'll be back in 20 seconds to start answering some of these questions. All right. Okay, some really good questions. First question is from Diana. Can you tell us what happens in March in K through 12 education? It seems super high. Diana, I have no idea. And so if other people who are in K through 12 fundraising have a good sense of what's driving March giving K through 12, please put in the chat. I have no idea. It's a great question. Rebecca, what is Stock Monday? So Stock Monday is a newer event, but gets really sharply increased participation lately. And it's right before Giving Tuesday. And the logic of it is this: stock gifts are so much bigger than cash gifts from exactly the same people. So Stock Monday is a moment of education right before Giving Tuesday and end of year push in order to encourage stock giving. Because the result is that you'll get much larger gifts from the same people. So that's what Stock Monday is. Our team's done a lot of work with a lot of partners on it. It's pretty cool. So that's there. Susan asks, with the increased standard deduction and fewer people able to take advantage of charitable tax deductions, is the year-end deadline still as impactful, say for donors making decisions on RMDs? So Susan, I'm going to give a little extra context. It's a very smart question. In 2017, new tax legislation was passed that took effect in 2018. There were a bunch of changes. The standard deduction went up, and the things that got you past the standard deduction were crammed down. Meaning, if you're in a place like New York or New Jersey or California, you were capped at how much state and local taxes you could deduct. If you had a large mortgage, you were capped at how much mortgage interest you could deduct, right? And so this is all different. And what it means is that we went from about 30% of Americans itemizing deductions to about 10%. So for 90% of people, these tax deadlines don't really matter to the same degree they once did. But so it's a good question. And Susan has a correct note here that absent people who are taking money out of retirement accounts where it's still really beneficial, that's right. So we do see it to be useful as a deadline. It's interesting to see that behavior hasn't changed yet, right? This sort of year over year drumbeat around end of year has really allowed us to continue to see that. So that's interesting. We'll keep an eye on it this year and see if that's shifted, but it hasn't sort of dropped, December as a portion of giving compared to previous years, as far as we can tell. So great question. There are some questions around millennials self-reporting as philanthropists. it is just an identity question. So that it wasn't how much do you give or how much do you volunteer. It was just say, do you identify as a philanthropist? So that's a great question. There's some questions around what order do you recommend the higher amounts to be when you're asking for them? Generally, I've seen gifts go from left to right of increasing value. And so that at least is what the research study did. And so if you want to mirror the effect, you could do that. You could also experiment it and switch it around and see, especially if you have a larger database and you can run some experiments and let us know. But that's what the research shows to date. Lisa says, do you mention amounts in the letter, or donor form is amounts, but don't usually mention the actual letter? Lisa, I believe that's true. So you really, on your donor form, on your credit card form, on your mailback slip or whatever it may be, that's usually where the amounts show up, unless you're going to ask a specific donor for a specific amount. Colleen asks, is a THASK, which is a thank you / ask, really okay? Colleen, one area you might want to think about is really using it to just share more information and gently ask. So instead of saying, hey, thanks for your gift, now give us a planned gift, you might say, thanks so much. Other people tend to do this. If you're interested in learning more, learn more here. It's much more of a service and a softer ask than the sort of hard ask that you might make in the first place. Great question. Audrey also posted some cool, thank you, Audrey, some research on ask strings, and I'll share it there. And I guess the last question is around, people are asking about staff giving. And, I think the important thing is to make clear that it's super optional. Say, look, you're more than welcome not to give, but we welcome, the chance to do so. A couple notes here. This will probably make your team better fundraisers as they feel what it's like from the other side, as they go through the donate forms and think about their own decisions. And two, when people are reinforced with the idea they have a choice, they're often even more likely to opt in. I used to do some email fundraising for President Obama after he was first elected. And one of the things we played with was this idea of saying like, hey, can you give $20? And it used to just be this link, right? Give $20. And we would say, have this button that said yes or this button that said no. And actually pushing people to make that yes, no decision actually increased the number of yeses compared to people that just opted out. So you can explore that a little bit more, but it's really interesting to see. So making it super clear that it's optional will probably increase both your giving, your overall giving, and your level of comfort. All right, so let's pause there, give everyone a little bit of time back. We're almost at 12:50. Just wanted to say a huge thank you for joining. There's Q&A, et cetera. We will be doing another session November 15th. If you haven't already taken the survey, we're thinking about a couple of different topics for that date. And so we'd love your feedback on it, and just make a note there. And then if you need anything or you want to connect, feel free to find me on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at patrick@freewill.com. And with that, wanted to just say, again, a big thank you for pushing yourself to learn, for really powering through a challenging end of year. A big happy Halloween to everybody who's celebrating or dressing their kids up in something super cute. Feel free to bring pictures and links to that to the next session. And hope to see many of you in Reno. But just lastly, just thanks again for joining, and really delighted to be here with all of you and see you all very soon.